This panel is, I'm so sorry, is Academics Against Borders, Analyzing and Critiquing Borders. I also want to quickly plug a couple of things. One, our program, which we have a digital program online, and within that we'll have the list of everyone's work, which there are several folks on this panel, including Dr. Maha Hilal, who has a forthcoming book that's within that. Also, Michaelangelo has some work in there. Other folks do as well. Additionally, one last thing, we've expanded our language justice to include not just Spanish and English, but also American Sign Language. So with that, we have created a language justice fund, and we have an incredible language justice 21 OBC poster that is for sale as well for $15 in English and in Spanish, so that we can continue having expansive language justice for years to come for Open Borders Conference. So thank you very much, and I'll kick it over to Fabio.
Thank you very much for attending our last session of the day. This is the panel called Academics Against Borders, Analyzing and Critiquing Borders. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our most excellent panelists for our last session. Dr. Maha Hilal is the inaugural Michael Ratner Fellow with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. She's also an organizer with Witness Against Torture and a steering committee member of the D.C. Justice for Muslims Coalition. Concurrent with these roles, Dr. Hilal is also a co-principal investigator with the Torture Treatment Initiative of Tulane University's Traumatology Institute. She was previously the executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedom, an organization dedicated to addressing civil and human rights abuses related to preemptive prosecutions and thought crimes in the war on terror. She earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. Reece Jones is a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow and a professor and the chair of the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is the author of the book White Borders, Violet Borders, and Border Walls, as well as the edited book Open Borders in Defense of Free Movement. He is editor-in-chief of the journal Geopolitics. Michaelangelo Landgrave specializes in state and local politics, legislative studies of race, ethnicity, and immigration politics. His political science PhD is from the University of California at Riverside. He also holds a master's degree in economics from California State University, Long Beach. He's a joint postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University's Department of Politics and the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics in the 2021-22 academic year. He's also an associate fellow at the Office of Valuation Sciences in the General Services Administration of the U.S. federal government. And last but not least, we have Michael Zigismund, is a New York City attorney who practices in a diverse array of areas, such as criminal law and immigration law. He received his JD from the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, where he trained intensively with the school's criminal appeals clinic. He got his BA from Tufts University, from which he graduated magna cum laude. So welcome to everyone. And I will just start with Dr. Hilal. And the first thing I want to ask Dr. Hilal is about how people make citizenship claims and how claims to citizenship may reinforce the current immigration system.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Fabio. I should say that I am no longer the fellow at Institute for Policy Studies. I'm actually co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective, and I believe the current fellow at IPS was speaking earlier, Huri Peterson-Smith. So just a quick correction on that. So, you know, in response to your question, I think that there are a couple of preliminary questions that, you know, would be useful to ask, right? So for me, when I think about borders, right, we have to ask the question of what and who are borders for, number one. Number two, I think we need to ask, right, what is the purpose of borders? And how do they construct and entrench certain ideas about who belongs and who doesn't. So when we ask the question about who are borders for, right? Borders are not for certain groups of people, such as, for example, white Americans, European Americans, anyone who's sort of has a white identity, not across the board, right? There are other, for example, Chechens that may not fall into that category. But I think it's just important to recognize that borders are meant to enforce sovereignty and territoriality only for certain groups. And in the context of the post 9/11 world, right, borders became ever more important insofar as they're constructed by the state to keep the quote terrorists out, meaning that whoever was in the United States, right, generally speaking, obviously, that's not the case across the board, but just this idea that the United States did not engage in or does not engage in the violence of the people we're trying to keep out vis-a-vis borders. And the other thing I want to say about borders in particular is that the US government itself, and perhaps we can talk about this later, operates within an open border policy, right? When it comes to state violence. When it comes to, again, so when it comes to US state violence, the US has adopted an open border policy, which is to say that it ignores the borders of any country that it wants to invade, that it wants to bomb, that it wants to drone strike. So now let's talk about the question of citizenship. So for those of us that are advocates of open borders and abolishing borders, how does citizenship fit into this, right? So citizenship is a way of claiming rights on the basis of existing within certain borders. And in addition, right, when you're a citizen, you're theoretically granted certain rights that non-citizens are not. The problem then becomes, if we, as open border advocates, abolishing border advocates, are claiming certain rights on the basis of our citizenship, insofar as we do that, does it make and entrench the idea that we have more rights or that we are owed more rights than non-citizens? So by us using citizenship to make ourselves legible doesn't make non-citizens illegible. And what does that mean? And, you know, one of the cases I think about, although this isn't strictly an immigration issue, is about, I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was a case in the courts that was brought to suit by the Council on American Islamic Relations. And they were challenging the terror watch list. And in the case, it's been since, I don't know the current updates, but at the time, the judge in the case said it was unconstitutional. Of course, not in its totality, just insofar as how it was being implemented and practiced. But the important thing to recognize is that that particular ruling was going to only be applied to about 4,600 people on the list, which included American citizens and lawful permanent residents. However, the list, the terror watch list, had about 1.16 million people on it. In other words, right, when we think about who then was entitled to challenging these rights and potentially obtaining rights, it was an extremely small percentage. And so what does that mean for non-citizens? What does it mean for people that are undocumented, right? how do we simultaneously think about, critique, conceptualize borders and citizenship, especially as we participate in that system, because that's how it exists. And I think the last thing I'll say is, really, I think one of the crucial questions when it comes to borders, and of course, the idea that borders adjudicate humanity, is the question of state sovereignty, right? When we think about open borders and whether or not states would be receptive to it, some people advocate for open borders on the basis of economics, right? This will make our country stronger economically. Fewer people advocate for open borders on the basis of humanity, right? People deserve certain human rights, right? But then what does it mean for the state, right? In terms of state sovereignty and the way the state positions itself in the context of the global world. So if the United States, for example, opened its borders, which perhaps seemed inconceivable for many of us at this particular point in time, how would it exercise its sovereignty? And how would it exercise sort of its position and authority and control and hegemony over the world, right? So this policy of open borders obviously is deeply tied into state sovereignty. And so what does that mean for the state? And how do we push back on this element, right? And really advocate for open borders and thinking about then what do we have to do to deconstruct, dismantle, and abolish the state because of what we recognize sort of as an inherent contradiction. So let me stop there because I think I've gone a little bit further than the question.
Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much for updating and correcting your biographical information. So thank you very much. I'd like to now turn to Reece Jones out at the University of Hawaii, who has a new book called White Borders, The History of Race and Immigration in the United States from Chinese Exclusion to the Border Wall. And that just came out very recently from Beacon Press, so please check that out. So Reece, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about what the main argument of the book is and kind of what area of immigration research you're trying to speak to.
Yeah, thanks, Fabio. Aloha, everyone. I'm coming to you from Honolulu. I'm so excited that we can connect this way and that I can be part of this conference. And I share Dr. Hilal's thinking about open borders and no borders, and particularly the focus on the idea of a common humanity that should drive the way that we talk about these issues. I've been working on the issue of borders for 20 years now. And in all of my work, the idea of somewhere between an open borders and a no borders future has been at the core of what I've been arguing for. But one of the things that's always frustrated me is that for a lot of people, they think of borders as these things that are just natural. That it's something that countries have always had, and it's just normal for countries to restrict immigration into their territory, and it's this neutral thing that's just something that's common across all countries. And so what I try to do in White Borders, my new book that came out last month, is to look at exactly why the US implemented immigration restrictions and think about what were the things driving those when they were put in place in different eras. The project was started during the Trump administration or the Trump campaign, really, where I was really struck by the really extreme racist framing of immigration and the border. And I was interested to see, does that trace back through the history of the way the US has approached immigration restrictions? And it does. So what I found while working on this was that in every era, the way that immigration restrictions were put in place was fundamentally about racial exclusion and about protecting an idea of a white country in the United States. I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that the US didn't have any immigration restrictions at the federal level until the 1870s. And why was it suddenly necessary to put them in place at that time? Well, it's the arrival of the Chinese in the aftermath of the gold rush and statehood for California and the other West Coast states. As soon as a large group of non-white people start to arrive in the United States is when the US starts to implement restrictions on that immigration. And in the speeches in Congress and the Senate about the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's very explicitly about racial terms. The John Miller, a senator from California who introduces the Chinese Exclusion Act into Congress, he ends his speech saying he would trade the Chinese for any white people under the sun, was what he was looking for in terms of immigration. And we see that same thing happening in each era. Of course, the beginning of the 20th century, there's the rise of the race pseudoscience and the eugenics, and the 1924 Immigration Act is completely based on those ideas. When it passed in 1924, the Los Angeles Times headline the next day was "A Nordic Victory," referring to this hierarchy of races in Europe that saw the Northern Europeans, which the majority of Americans at the time were from, as the highest race. And it was a Nordic victory protecting this white culture in the country. The New York Times said the America of the melting pot comes to an end, and that from here on forward, the racial composition of the country would be made permanent. Even in 1965, the revisions that finally get rid of those national origins quotas, if you look at the speeches and the debates at the time, there was not the anticipation that that law would produce a more diverse immigration pool to the United States. The reason they did family reunification visas as the primary visa in that 1965 act was based on the idea that the US was 90% white at the time. And the thought was that thus 90% of family reunification visas would be for new white immigrants. And so that it would keep the racial composition of the country the same. And indeed, Teddy Kennedy says that on the Senate floor. He assures the critics that it's not going to change the demographics of the country. So, the reason I think this is important, and what I look at in my book, is to trace this history and to demonstrate this link between a white supremacist idea of who should belong in the United States and the use of immigration restrictions to protect that and to promote that. Because I think it hopefully can help to undermine that idea that borders and immigration restrictions are just normal and benign, and instead frame them as something that is a social justice issue. It's a race issue. It's something that's been used by white supremacists for generations to protect an idea of a white country. In the final section of the book, I look at who are the groups behind the recent return of anti-immigrant rhetoric. And in the book, I trace the Tanton network of anti-immigrant groups, which emerges in the 70s and 80s, gets fundings from some of the richest people in the world, Cordelia Scaife-May, for example, and sets up this suite of anti-immigrant groups that have had this profound impact on the way that the Republican Party, but also the media talks about immigration and frames that issue. And those Tanton network groups, many of them are designated hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So it's the same sort of white supremacist anti-immigrant rhetoric being repackaged and repurposed for the contemporary political situation. And of course, the Tanton network, it's groups like FAIR, Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA, Progressives for Immigration Reform, Californians for Population Stabilization, US Tech Workers. There are over a dozen of these groups that this one man, John Tanton, had a hand in setting up. And they have been able to reshape the way that we talk about these issues. So what comes out of my book, I think, is a couple of things. One is the need to talk about open borders and free movement as not some sort of radical idea, but rather as a fundamentally moral idea and as a mechanism for contesting white supremacist notions in the country. But secondly, it's the realization that the people on the other side, this Tantan network of groups, are extremely well funded. There's a single foundation, the Colcom Foundation, that from 2005 to 2018, the last year of tax documents I had when I was working on the book, had donated almost $180 million to these anti-immigrant hate groups, right? So it gives them this enormous amount of money to produce experts to testify before Congress, to write op-eds to give to politicians, to write draft laws for anti-sanctuary cities and things like that, and to influence media reports, right? Because the media feels this obligation with any issue to provide both sides of things, right? And so these Tantan network groups, particularly Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA, and FAIR, are consistently referenced in the mainstream media to provide this kind of extreme anti-immigrant counterpoint to ideas of even just basic immigration reform. And what I found when I was working on the book is that these groups were behind a lot of the failures of immigration reform over the last 30 years, right? So they're behind things like Prop 187 in California. The funding came from them. The stopping of comprehensive immigration reform in 2007, again in 2013 and 14, is directly done by these Tantan network groups. And so I think what I find in the book is that we need to realize kind of the scale of the machine on the other side that's talking about harder borders, more walls, stricter immigration rules, reducing the total number of immigrants to the United States, and that hopefully through events like this, we can start to strategize on how we can counter that and come up with narratives that make the open borders position seem like the rational choice, not the radical choice, right? To me, the radical choice is building walls, is forcing people to migrate through these dangerous places, immediately deporting people or removing people who apply for asylum at the border, right? So those, to me, should be seen as the radical ideas, and the notion that people should simply be able to move freely across the face of the earth should be the common sense moral position. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to the discussion as we continue.
Thank you very much for that summary of your very interesting and very new book. The questions are coming in on the Q&A, so all attendees, please use the Q&A box, and after everybody gives their initial discussion, then we'll start going through the questions. Michael Zigismund out in New York City. I understand that you're an attorney who works on immigration issues, and I understand that you have a very interesting case that has really would help people understand what the immigration system, how it operates.
Sure. I think you're referring to my terrorism case, which is one of my favorite cases throughout my career so far. And thank you very much for having me, everybody. The interpreters, if I speak too quickly, please let me know. I've been told by the court interpreters that I speak fairly quickly sometimes. This case is a wild one. My client was accused of terrorism. He came over in 2000, 2001. Back in 1999, you remember Kosovo, Serbia. Serbia under Milosevic was committing genocide against the Kosovars. My client was one of the Kosovars. And what he did amongst many other people in Kosovo was he joined the Kosovo Liberation Army. That's the KLA. It's because he joined the KLA that eventually he ended up having problems. But at the time, in 1999, what he was doing was he was too young to fight. He was like 17, something like that. Nobody would let him actually fight in the front line. They made him take civilians from war zones and bring them to the border of Albania, where they can seek refuge. He also transported medicine back and forth. He did carry a weapon, but it was only for the purpose of communication with other people in the KLA. Eventually, he got injured. He made his way to the United States, where he claimed asylum. He won asylum circa 2000, 2001. That's approximately 20 years ago. He still does not have his green card. And the reason why he still doesn't have his green card is because from approximately 2001, which was September 11th, when we got very, very interested in the possibility that terrorists were a huge, huge problem. From 2001 until approximately now, a year or two ago, which is when I had this case, the KLA, among many other organizations around the world, were considered to be potentially terrorist organizations. And so this guy who was helping out so many people in Kosovo ended up remaining in the United States in a kind of a legal purgatory. He got asylum, he was able to work, but he couldn't get his green card. He couldn't be a permanent resident. He couldn't move his way to citizenship because USCIS, the immigration authorities, kept his case on ice while they tried to figure out what they wanted to do with him and with people like him and with their definition of the KLA as a terrorist organization or not. Now, to be sure, the KLA did definitely commit terrible, terrible acts. But the question is then, what do we do with this guy who's here, who, as I learned while dealing with his case, he started 2 businesses, has no criminal record, has a US citizen wife, has multiple US citizen kids, is actually loved by the local precinct. He gets like these certificates of like a good citizenship because he gives pizzas, free pizzas to fundraisers for the police. Fast forward 2018 or 2019, when he came to my office, he came in with a notice of intent to terminate his asylum status because USCIS believed that he was a terrorist. And they said the KLA did terrible things. Also, you carried weapons out in Kosovo. So we believe that you're a terrorist. Come 30 days from now to our office and explain to us why you're not a terrorist and why we should not take away your asylum and potentially deport you from the United States. So he hires our office to handle his case. I learned all of this stuff about his background. I learned all of this stuff about what he did in Kosovo, about the KLA itself, and what he's been doing in the United States. And we ended up putting together a massive package for him. The first thing we did was we argued that the KLA is not a terrorist organization. One of many points that we made in that argument was to say, if the KLA was a terrorist organization, then the United States had to have been aiding and abetting the KLA when it was committing its terrorist acts, because the United States was arming, training, funding, and diplomatically supporting the KLA against the Serbians at that very time. Among other arguments, we also explained how this guy is an amazing human being who definitely, at the time, did not commit terrorism. He was engaging in humanitarian activities. And here in the United States, I mean, this is the model citizen. I ended up sleeping approximately a half hour before the very meeting with USCIS. I booked my way over to a 7:30 a.m. meeting with USCIS, my clients, in the middle of Long Island. And there we ended up having a 5-hour meeting with in a windowless room, no breaks whatsoever. I ended up falling asleep in the middle of it. To wake myself up, I needed mints. So I was going into my bag for mints. All I had was Tic Tacs, and it made all this noise. Everybody turned around, and I ended up offering them Tic Tacs in the middle of this intense conversation. Eventually, by the end of it, we won that our application or our response to the notice of intent to terminate. USCIS said, it turns out we don't have enough evidence to prove that you're a terrorist, and therefore no worries. A few weeks ago, the client reached out and said, I still don't have my green card. And we are now in conversations to be hired to try to push USCIS to move forward on his green card application on the basis of asylum, as well as his marriage to a US citizen. As far as I'm concerned, we shouldn't be hired for anything. They shouldn't be paying any extra money. This guy deserves to be here, period. And the only reason why he is not here permanently with a green card is because we have the kind of system that we have, which is essentially closed borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your story really reminds us that the immigration system places extraordinary burdens on people that most people don't know about unless they happen to be on the ground, either as an immigrant or somebody who's helping or assisting immigrants. And also that is the best use of Tic Tacs in promoting freedom I've ever heard of. So you should be hired by the Tic Tac people to promote that. Okay, so our last panelist, and we've got some great questions in the Q&A, so we'll get to them. But first, I want to hear from Michaelangelo Landgrave, who is a political scientist. Maybe you could take a few moments to tell us about your research and how you think about immigration as a political issue.
Sure. So my work that's most directly related to open borders at the moment is some working papers that I've got where I'm trying to better understand the determinants of public support for open borders. And I'm running several survey experiments where I manipulate different keyhole solutions regarding open borders and support for open borders with Canada, because I'm interested in seeing, like, is it possible to actually get a majority or supermajority of people to agree with open borders as a concept? Because if we can do that, then I think there's a political path to forward. You know, if we can't get the general public to support us, then there's really little future for open borders. But if we can get a majority or supermajority of people, I think we've got a future. And I'm happy to report that I've found that most people, at least in the case of Canada, are willing to support open borders with Canada. Now, I understand that's probably not the most pressing need for us. You know, we probably think about open borders in regards to Latin America or Africa or the global South. But if we can at least get people to support the idea for open borders with Canada, I think that gives us optimism that we can slowly win them over for open borders more generally, and not just with our neighbor to the north. That said, I'm kind of always surprised that we don't already have open borders in Canada. And my understanding is, maybe this is showing my age, is that a couple of decades ago, there was essentially open borders with Canada. It's really 9/11 that really changed things. Anyway, so that's a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment.
Thank you very much. And I grew up in the era where, you know, people would move between Canada and the United States and just completely forget to do paperwork. You know, just they wouldn't fill anything out. And if there was ever any issue, it was pretty easy to rectify with the people in coats and ties. But that changed. You're right. That's a very recent thing. And nobody ever considered Canada to be a dire threat to the United States, yet they've regulated movement. So anyway, we have a lot of great questions. And so please scroll to the bottom. There are 3 dots at the bottom. Run your cursor over it, click the Q&A button, and type in your comments. And the first question for Dr. Hilal is, what do you mean by state? When your discussion of deconstructing or thinking about the state, what is it that you mean when you say that?
Fabio, I have a quick question. Would it be better to just sort of state all the questions that we answer just for the sake of time?
Currently, we're at 7 questions.
Okay.
And so I think it's a little bit easier just to go one at a time, because some of them are directed to some people, some of them are not directed to other people. And, you know, we can use a little bit of air traffic control here. But what the first one is for you.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, really, I'm just operating on a basic definition of what a nation state would be, which is just the idea of sovereign territory. And in the context of borders, it's obviously sovereign territory marked by borders. And I think that's a pretty basic and typical explanation and definition in the context of international relations. Since the question has really no more to it than that, I will just stop here for time.
And we do have about 23 minutes left, so definitely we can get through most of these. So the next question is for Reece Jones. Let me just read out. Why were immigration restrictions not enacted against Irish immigrants in the 1840s or 50s, even though they were perceived by many Americans at the time as a threat to the country? They also say in the comment, this is Joel Newman, Irish immigrants may not have been considered white at the time. I'm not a historian, so I don't know how accurate that is, but that's the question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I should also say that I am not a historian of this era either. And in my book, I focus on the immigration restrictions that were enacted. So, but I can say a little bit about this. There definitely were a lot of efforts to restrict Irish immigration in this period. The Know Nothing Party became quite influential in the middle of the 1850s. At one point in Massachusetts, I think the governor, Henry Gardner was the governor at that time, and most of the legislature were members of the Know Nothing Party in like the 1840, 1855, 1857 era. And they did enact restrictions on Irish immigration at the state level. The question about white or not white for Irish, I think from the way that I really read this period, the stronger issue for a lot of people was the Catholicism of the Irish immigrants rather than simply a racial question at that moment. Most previous immigrants to the US had been Protestant during that period. And so I think it was specifically the Catholicism that was the thing that was perhaps the strongest mark against Irish arrivals. So in this period, a number of individual states did enact their own immigration restrictions. So Massachusetts, so of course the Constitution says there can be no immigration restrictions until 1808. Which was about slavery. It was about protecting the right of importing slaves, but it also meant there could be no restrictions on immigration until 1808 either. And so after 1808, individual states took it upon themselves to put in place their own restrictions. So Massachusetts was the first, and they had restrictions on the poor and on the insane, and New York as well had some early restrictions like that. During that period, though, they only turned away something like less than 1% of the people who arrived in that era. So there were rules, but they were fairly loose, I think you could say. Southern states also started to put in place immigration restrictions in the 1820s. South Carolina was the first one that put limits on the arrival of free Blacks at ports, with the idea that free Black people would possibly lead rebellions against slavery, right? Because of course the rebellion had just happened in Haiti. And so a number of Southern states put in place those restrictions. The Supreme Court considered these state level restrictions a couple of different times. In the 1830s, they ruled that they were okay. But then in 1849, in the passenger cases, the Supreme Court ruled that only the federal government could impose immigration restrictions. States continued to try to do this. So California had some restrictions on the Chinese as well. And this came back before the Supreme Court in 1875 in Henderson versus the mayor of New York, and Chui Long versus, I forgot the name of the person that was in that case, Freeman, I think his last name was. And in both of those cases, the Supreme Court ruled in 1875 that it's only the federal government that can limit immigration into the country. So that's probably too long of an answer to a relatively direct question. But that's why after 1875, we start to see these federal restrictions, because the Supreme Court had ruled by that point 3 times that it was only the federal government that could restrict who could enter the territory of the US.
Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes left, so definitely take a few moments for more history. The next question is from Adolfo, who asks an interesting question. I'll just turn it over to the entire panel. How would you leverage the economic power of the immigration population to lobby or promote better immigration policies? So maybe we can start with the resident political scientist who might have some ideas, and we can go around the table.
So I'll take it first if anyone doesn't mind. So I think what we could do is not so much focus on just migrants, but the corporations that migrants work for. So I think, and you see this already, see a lot of large corporations such as Facebook and such. They have a large migrant population amongst their workers, and you see that they're the ones really pushing forward reform and migration. Admittedly, it's partly for selfish reasons. They want to make sure that skilled workers can come to the United States and be employed. But I think it's these corporations that have the most economic power and most lobbying power to get reform done broadly. That's my take on that question.
Let's see if other panelists have comments. Michael Zigismund, do you have any comments on lobbying, perhaps? Is your experience as a lawyer?
I have no comments on lobbying whatsoever,
Okay.
at least as far as this panel is concerned. But in thinking about the question, my way of thinking about open borders, immigration, and change is very, very idea-centric. which is appropriate to this panel with academics. And I guess I want to take this moment to comment. I'm not sure if anybody here is aware, I used to be an immigration restrictionist myself. And the way I got over to here is through the power of ideas. I just kept reading and finding out more and more information. So whether there's lobbying, whether there's money involved, or it's just in the middle, if it's just conversation or people writing things, ideas really, really matter.
Dr. Hilal.
I don't have a response really to this question, but the next question I do.
Oh yeah, there's definitely lots of questions for you. So we'll get to you. Reece, do you have any comments on lobbying and political change?
Yeah, I think, one of the challenges that we face, which I think has been hinted at a few times during this conversation, is the problem of the way that power is organized globally right now, because power is organized on a state basis, right? So individual states control fairly absolutely what happens within their territories. And that makes it really difficult to address global issues. This is something I talk about in my previous book, Violent Borders, where a number of the problems we face today, I mean, right now, world leaders are in Glasgow trying to hammer out a climate deal, but these deals are always based on individual states making pledges, and they're often not enforceable in any sort of way because we don't have any sort of a global mechanism for regulating that. So the problem of the climate is global, but the solutions we have are contained by these containers of the state, by borders. And so it's never gonna, there's a mismatch. It's never gonna work out, right? So that's why we can't seem to come up with a solution to that. I think we see the same issue with economic issues globally, right? Because corporations can move across borders, whereas labor cannot, and regulators cannot, right? And so it ends up being a race to the bottom in global wages. And then the issue of migration as well, right? This is a situation where globally we have people moving. Humans have always migrated, right? The history of humanity is a history of migration. But borders have become a way of protecting privileges, of restricting access to those privileges, and increasingly using violence to do that. And because of the way this state system is set up, we've given this right to make the decisions about who can move and who can't to these individual states, rather than having some sort of global understanding of it. So it's another case, I think, of where it's a global problem that we're trying to manage on these individual state basis. And it's producing a lot of violence. It's producing a lot of deaths. It's producing a lot of inequality that are really, I think, unnecessary. So that to me, though, gets at that was a long answer to why lobbying is often not so successful, because we tend right now to still be bounded by these states when we think about these issues, right? So I feel like a lot of, and I don't mean this as a criticism of the pro-immigration groups in the US, but they tend to be fairly narrowly focused on the rights of immigrants who are already here, right? And trying to improve the situation for DACA recipients or dreamers or things like that, which of course is absolutely important. But I think really to address these issues, we need to start thinking about it at a much bigger scale, and to have some sort of a way to conceptualize the rights of people on the move globally, rather than always looking at it at the individual state-by-state basis.
Great. So there is a question, actually another one directed at Dr. Hilal, and I'll read the text of the question. Dr. Hilal asked about making ourselves legible as opposed to ineligible for citizenship. This distinction seems to echo historical English and literacy requirements, which are also racially discriminatory. Can you share more about what you meant in that statement?
So Fabio, I actually answered that question in writing. And I mentioned that just because I think that the question that Luis asks is also important. But basically, to sum up my response to the anonymous question, what I was talking about was legibility and illegibility, not eligible and ineligible. And the distinction is between making something clear. So when citizenship, and when we define the citizen as something legible, something the state can read, right? That's the idea. What we're talking about is that when we exercise the rights theoretically afforded to us by the state, then we are entrenching the idea that we have certain rights that others that are not as clearly marked in this, construction don't have. So when we say we have rights as citizens, that means that others don't have rights or the same set of rights because they are non-citizens. So I'll just kind of leave it at that, just because I did provide a written response. But I wanted to answer the question from Luis specifically because I think that this is really important when we talk about open borders. And there is this sort of assumption that the United States, that people migrate and immigrate to North America, Europe, Australia, right? That there's sort of these havens, these beacons of freedom and prosperity and democracy. And there's a lot less of the idea that people are coming to this country or other sort of white countries because of the ways in which the US has intervened and often destroyed other countries. And, I come from an immigrant background. My family's from Egypt. And do I think that my family would have immigrated to the United States if there hadn't been the context that there was, right? With dictatorships, ongoing violence, perhaps, perhaps not. But I don't think we should always de facto assume that everyone just wants to migrate to these countries. And another especially important point is when we talk about people arriving desperately, let's think about why this might be the case. Why were Afghans desperately trying to come to the United States or at least get out of Afghanistan in the quote end of the Afghan war on Afghanistan in August? It's because the US played a significant and huge role in destroying their country. So we have to sort of make a distinction, right, between, the idea that there's this desperation based on I just want to get out of my country versus my country has been destroyed. There are no longer any opportunities, economic, social, cultural, whatever, which has driven the sort of migration outside of the country. And so I just think it's just really important because when we talk about open borders, we then necessarily have to talk about US intervention and this cyclical pattern where the United States is intervening in other countries, right? Take South America, right? Where there has been significant economic intervention and violence, then producing conditions in that country that then make people want and need to leave, and then barring them from the country as if there is no relationship to what the US has done. So to conclude this idea and this my response, part of answering the question of open borders is also about dismantling the construction of the United States and other countries as inherently generous and as one that is extracted, again, from the conflict and the violence that has ensued in other countries.
Thank
Fabio,
you
can I
very-
follow up? On that?
Yeah, I was actually going to direct the next question to you, so please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Hilal about that. And I think if we don't even have to have it be US centric when we talk about it in those terms, because if you look at the European Union and countries in Europe, a lot of the disruptions in Africa that are sending people migrating are because of the history of colonialism there and the extractions that happened in the first half of the 20th century and continued interventions, right, because of the economic dependency that was produced through colonialism that continue to send people on the move today. So I think you can see that as not just a US-centric idea. To follow up a little bit more on the question, though, which was asking if millions of people are going to show up in the US. I think one thing to emphasize is that although the US does have the largest number of total immigrants today in the world, something like 40 million. If you look at that on a per capita basis, the US is something like 60th in the world in terms of the immigrant population, right? So we are having nowhere near the largest number of immigrants entering the US compared to other countries around the world. So, and I would suggest that the US is also a very empty country, right? There's a lot of space where millions of more people could certainly live in the US. So I don't think that it would be as much of a problem as people anticipate it might be. You know, there's been some research on how many people globally might want to migrate if they had the opportunity to. And I think that research found that something like 14% of the world's population would like to migrate if they could, right? So that means 86% of the world's population doesn't want to migrate, right? But all of those people don't want to come to the US, right? I mean, some want to go to Europe, but there's a lot of inter-Asian migration, for example, right? There are tons of people migrating from Bangladesh into India and movements like that as well, or from India or Indonesia into or Philippines to the Middle East to work. So I think that the assumption that it's all going to be to the US is just not right. Moreover, a lot of the reason that people stay for long periods today is because it's so hard to migrate. The reality is most people who would like to migrate would like to do it for a brief period of time to work, you know, maybe a year to work and then go back to their homes, right? They don't want to necessarily be a permanent migrant to a different place. And there are lots of reasons for that. They've got family in that place. They like their culture and language and food that they eat at home. So they want to be a temporary migrant. But because we've made it so difficult to do that, that's just not an option anymore in the way that it was in previous decades. So we've kind of produced this permanent immigration class that doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
Can I just quickly comment on the last thing that Reece said?
Go for it.
This is a big issue for me. I am constantly talking to my clients about the penalty for leaving the country. The penalty for leaving the United States is tremendous. It is something called the 3 and 10-year bar. I repeat this on a regular basis in my office. This is how it works. If you're in this country unlawfully, whether you crossed the border unlawfully or you came in on a visa lawfully, but then overstayed the expiration of the visa, if you're in the country unlawfully, at least half of the year, then the minute you leave the country, you cannot come back for another 3 years. If you stay here unlawfully for a year or more, and you leave the country, then you cannot come back for another 10 years. This is a huge penalty on people who want to leave and then come back to the United States. And what that produces is people just not leaving the United States. Why has there been such an explosion in illegal immigration since the 1990s? Well, because this was a law that was signed in by Bill Clinton in the middle of the 1990s. And now all of a sudden, there's a tremendous amount of people who are here who otherwise would not be.
Thank you. There was a question that was informational that was asked of Reece, but I think I'd like Reece to say at least a couple of sentences. We have 5 minutes, so please put your last questions in the Q&A. What is the Tanton Network? Maybe you could take a minute or two to explain what that is, because a lot of us might not know.
Yeah, so this is something that before I started working on this book, White Borders, that I knew that these groups existed, but I had no idea how influential they were and how much of a difference they had made over the last 30 years in terms of moving anti-immigrant rhetoric back into the mainstream in the US. So it's tied to a guy named John Tanton, who kind of bizarrely was an ophthalmologist who lived in upstate Michigan, and he worked full-time as an eye doctor. He did 4,000 eye surgeries over his lifetime. But he also had this very strong anti-immigrant beliefs in the 1970s, and he couldn't find other people to work on that. And so he started this series of groups starting in 1979 with a group called FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, and then through the 80s and 90s, Center for Immigration Studies, Numbers USA. And at the same time, he located these really wealthy donors to support those groups. And so today, these are very well-funded groups with ties to the white supremacist movement. Many of them are labeled hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center, but nevertheless, the huge amount of money they have means that they've been able to be very influential on immigration issues. So I talk about in the book, but a number of these figures end up in the Trump administration. Stephen Miller is closely tied to the Center for Immigration Studies. Jeff Sessions is also closely tied to the Center of Immigration Studies. Figures from FAIR ended up in Julie Kirchner, for example, was the executive director of FAIR and then worked in USCIS, right? So I document about 24 figures who used to work for anti-immigrant hate groups who worked in the Trump administration, right? So there's this kind of pipeline of figures from there into the Trump administration. And so they're kind of behind the scenes. People have said John Tanton is the most influential American that most people have never heard of. And after working on this for a number of years, I definitely agree. He's had this huge influence in shaping the ways that the public talks about immigration and shifting it towards a more anti-immigrant view.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, and I want to ask Michaelangelo one question. If you could answer in a tweet, then we'll say goodbye. As somebody says, persuasion in politics, what is the argument or what's the best thing that we know that might make people more friendly towards immigration?
So the biggest effect I find is when you make it reciprocal. If you make it clear to people that if we open up the borders, it also means open borders for them. It means that Americans can go to Canada and Europe and Latin America. That seems to be the strongest effect that I've found so far. It increases support for open borders by about 20 percentage points, which is huge. And that's amongst both Democrats and Republicans.
Wow, I'm glad I asked that question. That's wonderful because that takes us exactly to 6 o'clock. I want to thank Dr. Hilal. I want to thank Michael Zigismund. I want to thank Michaelangelo. I want to thank Reece coming all the way from Hawaii. I know it took you forever to get here. I want to thank all our donors at whatever level. You all made it possible, all the attendees and our interpreters who've been working so hard. Unless you've ever translated something yourself, you don't know how hard this can be to be an interpreter. So thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to the staff at the Free Migration Project. And thank you to everybody who's going to log in. And that's it. And I thank you. Goodbye. And I just want to check in with Jamila, our MC. Do we have anything else you want to say before we bid people a good weekend?
Thank you all so much for coming and being a part. I appreciated this panel. It was incredible. Wow. I'm very excited that we got to talk about the Exclusion Act and also the War on Terror and its implications, because it's something we don't talk enough about. And I'm so grateful that folks came today and were a part of all of these great panels and keynotes with us. So thank you all so very much. Thank you all to all the panelists from this panel as well. And I hope that we get to see you guys again next year. Come through for fall 2020. Ooh, sorry, I'm still caught up in COVID time. I won't pretend. Fall 2022's Open Border Conference. And yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Have a safe weekend, and I hope to see you again.